Hi there, and welcome to this week's study questions, which are looking at the first part of John chapter 1. This Sunday past, we look at John 1, verses 3 to 18, 4 to 18 rather. Clem looked at verses 1 to 3 the previous week. But why don't you take a few minutes just to read through the whole of verses 1 to 18, nice and slow. It's a beautiful piece of scripture, just describing who Jesus is and why he came. And we're going to spend a few 40 minutes or so looking at that now. But pause the video first, read through the passage, maybe once or even twice if you have time. Just soak up the beautiful language and the words which describe who Jesus is. So why don't you pause the video while you do that? So the passage starts, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. And we looked at this last week, didn't we? This idea that Jesus is the Word, the Logos, this kind of force behind the origin of everything, as the Greeks understood it. This passage talks about he, understands the Word, Jesus to be a person, part of the Godhead. He's there from the very beginning, before Genesis chapter 1, we talked about last week. From the very, very beginning, he was with God and he was God. He is someone who can be in relationship. He was with God. This is more than just a neutral force. This is a person who can be known, the creator person of all things. But our passage that we're looking at today from verse 4 begins with a tension between light and darkness. Verse 5 says, the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it or overcome it, depending on your translation. So there's this idea very early on of a tension between light and darkness. Who or what are light and darkness in this passage? What or who is the light and what or who is the darkness? See if you can determine what those are by looking at these couple of verses. So just pause and discuss that. The question is, who or what are the light and the darkness that are in conflict here, as described in verse 5? Well, we'll go back a verse to verse 4. In him, in Jesus, was life, and that life was the light of men. And so the light represents Jesus. But the darkness is this idea, I suppose, of everything, the consequence of sin. And we find this metaphor of darkness throughout the Bible. But there's this idea that the light the darkness cannot overcome the light. The light will win. So the darkness here is the consequence of sin. And then a little bit later on, John is introduced to us, John the Baptist. And so my question for us now is, what is his role in all of this? Just looking at the text of John chapter 1 here, what is John's role as described here? Well, John is introduced as a witness who came to testify concerning that light, to point to Jesus, so that through him all men might believe. John's very much happy to be number 2 to Jesus, isn't he? He doesn't want the limelight. His role is to point to who Jesus is and to draw attention to him. And as I was reflecting on this, I was thinking, I wonder, is there any way that we in the church, or some of us in the church, can struggle to be number 2 to Jesus? Is that something that you've seen, something that made you sense yourself that that's a struggle for you? Why don't you discuss that for a minute? Is it ever be a struggle to be number 2 to Jesus like John was? Discuss that for a moment. John's very happy to be number 2 to Jesus, to point to who Jesus was, to be a witness to him, to testify about him, all very legal language, isn't it? And then the passage continues that Jesus, this light of the world, was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. So it introduces this relationship between Jesus and the world. So my question for us now is, what is the world? I mean, didn't Jesus create the world? Why would there be a tension between Jesus and the world? Because it talks about the world did not receive him. So what is that tension between, or what is the world, or why is there tension between Jesus and the world? Because Jesus created the world in the first place. So discuss that for a moment or two. The world, of course, is described in Genesis 1 as God's creation, as God being very pleased with the world that he had created. But when sin entered the world, his world was distorted. And so the world, when the Bible talks about the world, it's talking about that part of creation that is in conflict with God and against him. And so when John 3:16 says God so loved the world that he sent his only son, it's that idea that God so loved even that part of his creation that was against him, that he moved in love towards that world to redeem it. The world represents the lost, that part of his creation that is against him. But we move on then to these beautiful verses 11 to 13, which some have said kind of summarize the whole gospel message. Let me read them for us. From verse 11, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. In what way do these verses act as a summary of the gospel message? Where do you see the gospel message in these couple of verses? Discuss that for a couple of minutes. Last Sunday, I really dug into verse 14 of this chapter. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. I said it was one of my favorite verses in the Bible. What difference does it make that Jesus became flesh, that he took on flesh? What difference does it make for your life today and tomorrow that Jesus did that? Discuss that amongst yourselves for a minute. Why does it matter that Jesus took on flesh? Brings us to our last question today. Looking at verses 17 through 18. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. But God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. In what way does Jesus make God known? In what ways does Jesus make God known? Discuss that amongst yourselves. As you finish, maybe take some time to pray through some of the themes in this beautiful passage of Scripture and take some time to thank God for what he has done, breaking into time and space to be with us, to die on a cross in our place, to come alongside us and be able to empathize and sympathize with us as one of us. A lot of things in this passage to be thankful for. And pray for one another, especially these days. They're difficult days, aren't they? With a lot of bad news in the media and so on. So take some time just to bring those concerns of yours to God.